She saved the man who didn't want saving. He survived by staying alone, until the woman he pushed away became the only thing standing between him and ruin. In the frozen highlands of Blackridge territory, two strangers built something stronger than survival. This is their story. If you want to see where this journey leads, stick around till the end, and drop a like and comment with the city you're watching from, so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The wind came down from the ridgeline like a blade. Ethan Vale stood at the edge of his property, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, staring at the valley below where the snow hadn't started yet, but would soon. October up here meant the world turned gray first, then white. It meant the ground got harder, the nights got longer, and the silence got so thick you could feel it pressing against your ribs. He liked it that way. The cabin sat behind him, small and square and built with his own hands. No neighbors for 15 miles. No town closer than 23. The outpost he ran, more a glorified supply depot than anything else, served trappers, prospectors, and the occasional fool who thought they could survive a winter in Blackridge without knowing what they were doing. Ethan sold them flour, oil, ammunition, and sometimes a warning. Most didn't listen. He didn't care. Caring was a luxury he'd left behind 3 years ago, buried in a grave he never visited because visiting meant remembering, and remembering meant breaking, and Ethan Vale did not break. Not anymore. He turned back toward the cabin, boots crunching over the frozen dirt. The sky was the color of old iron. A storm was coming, maybe 2 days out. He needed to split more wood, check the roof seams, make sure the chimney wasn't blocked. Routine kept you alive up here. Routine and not thinking too much. That's when he heard it. Hoofbeats. Ethan stopped mid-step, his jaw tightening. No one came this far out unless they were desperate or stupid. He reached instinctively for the rifle leaning against the porch rail, his eyes scanning the tree line. The sound grew louder, uneven, one horse moving slow. Then she appeared. A woman, alone, riding a dun mare that looked half-starved and bone-tired. She wore a dark wool coat too thin for the altitude, a hat pulled low, and a scarf wrapped around her face so only her eyes showed. She rode like someone who'd been in the saddle too long, shoulders hunched, body swaying slightly with each step the horse took. Ethan didn't move. She stopped about 20 feet from the porch, her breath misting in the cold air. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The mare huffed, shook its head. The woman sat perfectly still, watching him with eyes that gave away nothing. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You lost?" Her voice was quiet, steady. "No." "Then you're in the wrong place." "This the outpost?" "It is." "Then I'm not in the wrong place." Ethan's grip on the rifle didn't loosen. "What do you want?" She swung down from the saddle with the stiff movements of someone who'd been riding for days. When her boots hit the ground, she swayed just slightly, caught herself, then straightened. She pulled the scarf down. Her face was pale, sharp-featured, maybe 30 or a few years past it. Dark hair, eyes the color of slate. No warmth in them. No fear either. "Supplies," she said, "and a place to rest the horse." "Supplies I got. Rest. You'll have to find somewhere else." She didn't flinch. "There is nowhere else." "Not my problem. I can pay." "Don't need your money." She reached into her coat and pulled out a leather pouch, held it up. It clinked softly. "Silver," she said. "Not paper." Ethan's eyes flicked to the pouch, then back to her face. Silver was rare up here, valuable. Most people traded in goods or promises. He should have cared. He didn't. "Take your silver and go back the way you came." "Can't." "Why not?" "Because I'm not going back." There was something in the way she said it, flat, final, that made Ethan pause. He'd heard that tone before, in his own voice, late at night when the silence got too loud. It was the sound of someone who'd closed a door and thrown away the key. He studied her for another long moment. She didn't look away, didn't plead, just stood there in the cold, waiting. "Storm's coming," he said finally. "I know. You won't make it to the next town before it hits." "I know that too." Ethan exhaled through his nose, a sharp, frustrated sound. He didn't want this, didn't want her here, didn't want the complication, didn't want to be responsible for another human being who might need something from him. But the storm was real, and turning her out into it was a death sentence, and despite everything he'd buried, Ethan wasn't cruel, just empty. "One night," he said, You can sleep in the barn. I'll sell you what you need in the morning, then you leave. She nodded once. Fair enough. He gestured toward the small barn behind the cabin. Put the horse in there. There's hay and water. Don't touch anything else. She led the mare past him without another word, her footsteps quiet, deliberate. Ethan watched her go, then turned and went inside, shutting the door harder than necessary. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't want to. The barn was cold but dry, and the horse was grateful for both. Lillian Cross worked quickly, unsaddling the mare, rubbing her down with a fistful of straw, checking her hooves for stones. The animal nickered softly, pressing her nose into Lillian's shoulder. I know, Lillian murmured. We'll rest soon. She'd been riding for 11 days, pushing hard, sleeping little. Her back ached, her legs were stiff, and her hands were raw from the reins. But she'd made it. That was what mattered. She'd left everything behind, every lie, every compromise, every version of herself that had been shaped by other people's expectations, and come to the one place where none of it could follow. Blackridge territory. The end of the map. The place people went when they wanted to disappear. She wasn't running from the law. Wasn't running from a man, or debt, or scandal. She was running from a life where she'd been invisible, where her voice didn't matter, where she'd spent 28 years being told what to think, how to act, who to be. Her father's house, her brother's business, her uncle's charity. Always someone else's plan, someone else's world. She'd left it all. No explanation. Just a horse she'd bought with money she'd saved in secret, and a direction, west, then north, then higher. The man who owned this place, Ethan Vale, if the name on the supply ledger outside was accurate, hadn't wanted to let her stay. She'd expected that. Men like him didn't trust easily, and she didn't blame them. The world made you hard or it broke you. He'd chosen hard, so had she. Lillian spread her bedroll in the corner of the barn, pulled her coat tighter, and lay down on the straw. She didn't sleep right away. Instead, she stared up at the rafters, listening to the wind beginning to pick up outside, and thought about the look in Ethan Vale's eyes when he'd told her to leave. Empty, guarded, familiar. She'd seen that look before, in the mirror. Ethan didn't sleep much that night either. He sat by the fire, a tin cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, staring into the flames. The cabin was quiet except for the crackle of burning wood and the occasional gust of wind rattling the shutters. He told himself he was listening for the storm, but that was a lie. He was listening for her. It had been a long time since anyone had stayed on his property, even for a night. The last person had been a trapper named Carver, a loud, friendly man who'd talked Ethan's ear off about pelts and weather patterns and his wife back in Denver. Ethan had tolerated it for one evening, sold him supplies, and watched him leave with relief. This woman, whoever she was, hadn't said more than a dozen words, hadn't asked questions, hadn't tried to make small talk or justify her presence. She'd simply stated what she needed and waited. It unsettled him. Ethan drained the last of his coffee, set the cup aside, and stood. He moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. He couldn't see the barn from here, but he knew it was there, solid and silent. And inside it, a stranger who'd ridden into his carefully constructed isolation like a crack in glass. He turned away, jaw tight. One night, that's all she got. Then she'd be gone, and things would go back to the way they were supposed to be. Morning came cold and gray, the sky pressing down like a lid. Ethan was already awake when the first light touched the ridgeline, moving through his morning routine with mechanical precision. He fed the chickens, checked the water pump, brought in more wood. By the time the sun was fully up, or as much as it ever got up in October, he'd made a pot of coffee and fried 2 eggs in a pan over the stove. He didn't make extra. There was a knock at the door. Ethan paused, spatula in hand, then set it down and crossed the room. When he opened the door, she was standing there, hat in her hands, scarf around her neck. Her face looked less pale than yesterday, though the shadows under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept much either. "Morning," she said. He grunted. "You leaving?" "Need supplies first." "I'll get them. Wait here." He shut the door before she could respond, grabbed his coat, and headed for the outpost shed. It was a squat building adjacent to the cabin, shelves lined with canned goods, sacks of flour and beans, coils of rope, boxes of ammunition. Everything a person might need to survive in the high country, sold at prices that reflected how far from civilization they were. Ethan pulled a burlap sack from a hook and started filling it. Flour, salt, coffee, dried meat, matches. Enough for a week, maybe 2 if she was careful. He worked quickly, methodically, not thinking about why he was being generous. When he came back outside, she was still standing by the door, arms crossed against the cold. He handed her the sack. $12, he said. She reached into her coat and pulled out the leather pouch, counting out coins. Her fingers were slender, scarred along the knuckles. She placed the money in his palm without touching his skin. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, pocketing the coins. "Storm will hit tonight. If you're smart, you'll head south before it does." "I'm not going south." "Then you're not smart." Her mouth twitched, almost a smile. Almost. "Probably not." Ethan frowned. "Where are you going?" "Here." "What?" "I'm staying." He stared at her. "The hell you are." "I need work," she said, her voice calm, even. "You need help. I saw the fence post down by the road, saw the roof on the shed starting to sag, saw the garden plot full of weeds. That's none of your business. It could be. I don't need help. Everyone needs help. Not me." She met his eyes, and for the first time he saw something other than blankness there. Not pity, not sympathy, just a steady, quiet certainty that made his chest tighten in a way he didn't like. "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "I'll work. I'll earn my keep. You won't even know I'm here." "You can't stay." "Why not?" "Because I said so." "That's not a reason." Ethan's jaw clenched. "I don't owe you a reason." "No," she agreed. "You don't." Silence stretched between them, cold and sharp. The wind picked up, tugging at her coat. She didn't move. Finally, Ethan exhaled hard through his nose. "1 week," he said, the words dragged out of him like teeth. "You work, you stay out of my way, and at the end of the week, you leave. No arguments." "Agreed." He turned and walked back toward the cabin, shoulders tight. "Barn's yours. Don't expect meals." "Understood." He didn't look back. "Asaik." Lillian watched him disappear inside, then let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from the cold, but from the effort of standing her ground. She'd learned a long time ago that men like Ethan Vale didn't respond to pleading or charm. They responded to strength, to clarity, to someone who didn't flinch. She picked up the supply sack and carried it back to the barn. 1 week. She'd make it count. Bais. The first day, Lillian worked on the fence. She found tools in the barn, a hammer, nails, wire cutters, and set about repairing the posts that had rotted through or snapped in the wind. The work was hard, the ground frozen and unforgiving, but she didn't mind. Physical labor had a way of quieting the noise in her head, the voices that still whispered she'd made a mistake, that she should go back, that she was too weak to survive out here alone. She wasn't alone, though. Ethan was watching. She felt it more than saw it. Quick glances from the cabin window, the occasional shadow moving across the porch. He didn't approach, didn't offer advice or criticism, just watched, like he was waiting for her to fail. She didn't. By the time the sun started to sink, she'd repaired 6 posts and restrung a section of wire fence that had been sagging for what looked like years. Her hands were blistered, her shoulders ached, but the work was done. She walked back to the barn, washed her face and hands with cold water from the pump, and ate a small meal of bread and dried meat from her supplies. Then she lay down on her bedroll and stared at the ceiling. Outside, the wind was rising. The storm was coming. That night, the temperature dropped fast. Ethan felt it in the walls, the way the cold seeped through the cracks despite the fire. He added more wood, stoked the flames higher, and pulled his chair closer to the hearth. The wind howled outside, shaking the shutters, rattling the door. He thought about the woman in the barn. It wasn't insulated like the cabin. There was hay, a few old blankets, but it wouldn't be warm. She'd be cold, uncomfortable. Not his problem. He poured himself a cup of coffee, black and bitter, and tried not to think about it. Balk. Lillian woke to frost on the inside of the barn walls. Her breath misted in the air, her fingers numb despite the gloves she'd slept in. The horse was huddled in the corner, head low, and Lillian could see her ribs expanding and contracting with each breath. She sat up slowly, joints stiff, and pulled her coat tighter. Outside, the wind was a living thing, screaming and clawing at the world. Snow hadn't started yet, but it would. Soon, she stood, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and moved to the barn door. Through the gaps in the wood, she could see the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and steady. A single light glowed in the window. Warm, safe, occupied. Lillian turned away and went back to her bedroll. She didn't knock on his door. She didn't ask. The second day she fixed the roof on the shed. Ethan came out mid-morning to find her balanced on a ladder, hammering down loose shingles with quick, efficient strikes. She'd found the materials herself, shingles stacked in the corner of the barn, nails in a rusted tin. She didn't ask permission, just did the work. He stood there for a moment, watching, then turned and went back inside. That afternoon, he left a pot of stew on the porch. He didn't say anything, didn't bring it to her, just set it down, went back in, and shut the door. When Lillian came by an hour later, the pot was still warm. She stared at it for a long time, then picked it up and carried it back to the barn. She ate every bite. Bum. The third day, she cleared the garden plot. It was overgrown with dead weeds and tangled roots, the soil hard and unforgiving. Lillian worked methodically, pulling up the debris, turning over the earth with a spade she'd found in the shed. Her hands bled through the blisters, but she didn't stop. Ethan came out once, stood on the porch with his arms crossed, and watched her for 5 minutes without saying a word. Then he went back inside. That night, there was bread on the porch, fresh baked, still warm. Lillian took it. The fourth day, it snowed. Not much, just a light dusting that turned the world white and made everything quieter. Lillian woke to find the barn colder than before, the horse shivering despite the extra hay she'd piled around her. She spent the morning reinforcing the barn walls, stuffing gaps with straw and old cloth, anything to keep the wind out. By midday, her fingers were too numb to work, so she stopped, built a small fire in a metal drum, and huddled next to it. That's when the cabin door opened. Ethan stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the light. He didn't step out, just stood there, staring at the barn. Then he turned and went back inside. 10 minutes later, he came out again, carrying a wool blanket and a jar of something Lillian couldn't identify. He walked across the yard, snow crunching under his boots, and stopped a few feet from the barn door. He didn't knock. "Open up," he said. Lillian stood, pulled the door open. Cold air rushed in. Ethan's face was unreadable, his jaw tight. He shoved the blanket and jar at her. "Blanket's extra. Jar's salve for your hands." She took them, staring. Don't say thank you. Just use them." He turned and walked back to the cabin without another word. Lillian stood there, the blanket heavy in her arms, the jar cold against her palm. She looked down at the salve, then back at the cabin. The door was already shut. The fifth day, Lillian restacked the woodpile. It had been haphazard, logs scattered and uneven, some rotting from exposure. She sorted them by size, stacked them properly, covered the top with a tarp she'd patched together from scraps. It took hours. Her back screamed in protest. She didn't care. When she finished, Ethan was standing at the edge of the porch, watching. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know. Why did you?" "Because it needed doing." He didn't respond, just stared at her for a long moment, then turned and went inside. That night, there was coffee on the porch. A full pot, still hot, with a tin cup beside it. Lillian poured herself a cup, sat down on the steps, and drank it slowly. For the first time in 11 days, she wasn't cold. The sixth day, they didn't speak. Lillian worked on repairing a section of the outpost shed where the wind had torn off part of the siding. Ethan stayed inside, tending to his own work, whatever that was. She didn't ask. But when the sun set and the temperature dropped, she found a plate of food waiting on the porch. Beans, fried potatoes, a slice of bacon. She ate it sitting on the barn floor, the horse watching her with dark, gentle eyes. "It's not much," Lillian said softly, "but it's something." The horse nickered. Lillian smiled. The seventh day, the storm broke. It came in fast, the sky turning black, the wind roaring like a living beast. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, and within an hour, the world had disappeared. Lillian could barely see the cabin from the barn, just a faint glow of light in the distance. She secured the barn as best she could, made sure the horse had food and water, then huddled in her bedroll and waited. The wind shook the walls, the temperature plummeted, and somewhere in the chaos she heard a sound, a crack, loud, sharp, like a tree breaking, then a crash. Lillian bolted upright, heart pounding. She grabbed her coat, shoved her feet into her boots, and stumbled to the door. The wind nearly tore it from her hands as she yanked it open. Through the snow, she saw it. A massive tree limb had come down, smashing through the roof of the outpost shed. And near it, half buried in snow and debris, was a figure. Ethan. Lillian ran. The snow hit her face like needles, blinding and vicious. Lillian pushed through it, stumbling over ground she couldn't see, her boots sinking into drifts that were already knee-deep. The wind tore at her coat, tried to shove her back, but she leaned into it and kept moving. "Ethan!" Her voice was swallowed by the storm. She could barely see 3 feet ahead, just white chaos and the dark shapes of debris scattered across the yard. The tree limb was massive, thick as a man's torso, and it had come down hard enough to split the shed roof clean through. And underneath it, she saw his hand first, pale against the snow, fingers slightly curled. Then his arm, his shoulder, half his body pinned beneath a section of the collapsed roof and the limb itself. Lillian dropped to her knees beside him, her hand shaking as she brushed snow from his face. His eyes were closed, his skin gray, a gash across his forehead bleeding sluggishly into his hair. "Ethan. Ethan, can you hear me?" Nothing. She pressed her fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. For a terrible moment there was nothing, and her stomach dropped into a cold, hollow pit. Then she felt it, faint, uneven, but there. He was alive. Barely. Lillian looked up at the wreckage pinning him down. The beam was too heavy to lift, not without leverage, and the tree limb was tangled with it in a way that made the whole thing a death trap. If she moved the wrong piece, the rest could come down on top of him. The wind screamed, snow piled higher. She had minutes, maybe less, before he froze to death or bled out or both. She stood, her mind racing, and ran back to the barn. The horse looked up as she burst through the door, eyes wide and startled. Lillian grabbed a coil of rope from the wall, a hand axe, and the thickest plank of wood she could find. Her hands were clumsy with cold, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she didn't stop. She ran back. Ethan hadn't moved. The blood on his forehead was already freezing, dark and crusted. Lillian knelt beside him again, her hands hovering over the wreckage, trying to think, trying to see a way through this that didn't end with him crushed or her buried beside him. The beam first. She had to get the beam off him. She wedged the plank under the edge of it, using a chunk of broken wood as a fulcrum, and pushed down with all her weight. The beam shifted, groaned, but didn't lift. She adjusted the angle, braced her feet, and tried again. This time it moved, just an inch, but enough. She shoved a piece of debris under it to hold it in place, then moved to the tree limb. It was tangled with the roof boards, but the axe was sharp, and she swung it hard again and again, chopping through the smaller branches until she could pull the limb free. Her shoulders burned. Her hands were raw. She didn't care. When the limb finally came loose, she dragged it aside, then went back to the beam. She repositioned the plank, pushed again, and this time the beam lifted high enough for her to pull Ethan free. He was heavier than she expected, dead weight, his body limp and unresponsive. She hooked her arms under his shoulders and dragged him backward, away from the wreckage, onto clearer ground. Snow fell on his face, melting against his skin. His breathing was shallow, uneven. Lillian looked toward the cabin. It was closer than the barn, but the door was shut, and she didn't know if it was locked. She couldn't risk getting him halfway there and finding it barred. The barn, then. She grabbed him under the arms again and pulled. Her boots slipped in the snow, her legs shook, but she kept going, dragging him inch by inch across the yard. The wind fought her every step, and by the time she reached the barn door, her vision was swimming and her lungs felt like they were full of glass. She kicked the door open, pulled him inside, and collapsed beside him. For a moment she just lay there, gasping, her whole body trembling. Then she forced herself up. The horse was pressed into the corner, agitated and snorting. Lillian grabbed her bedroll, spread it on the ground, and rolled Ethan onto it. His face was pale, his lips faintly blue. The gash on his forehead was still bleeding, and when she ran her hands over his ribs, he flinched, unconscious but still feeling pain. Broken, maybe. Or bruised badly enough it didn't matter. She stripped off his wet coat, his boots, covered him with every blanket she had. Then she lit the small fire in the metal drum, fed it until the flames were steady, and dragged it as close to him as she dared. His breathing didn't change. Lillian sat back on her heels, staring at him, her mind blank with exhaustion and fear. She'd gotten him out. She'd gotten him inside. But now what? She didn't know how to fix this. She didn't know if he'd even wake up. The storm howled outside, and the barn creaked under the weight of the wind. Lillian pulled her knees to her chest, wrapped her arms around them, and watched Ethan's chest rise and fall in shallow, fragile breaths. She didn't pray. She just waited. Hours passed. The fire burned low, and Lillian fed it again, her movements mechanical. She checked Ethan every few minutes, his pulse, his breathing, the blood on his forehead. She cleaned the wound as best she could with water from her canteen and a strip of cloth torn from her spare shirt. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. But he didn't wake. His face was still gray, his skin cold to the touch despite the blankets. Lillian pressed her hand to his chest, felt the faint, uneven rhythm of his heart, and wondered how long a person could survive like this. Not long, probably. She stood, paced the length of the barn, then came back and knelt beside him again. Her hands were shaking, not from cold this time, but from something deeper, something she didn't want to name. Fear. Not of the storm, or the work, or the isolation. Fear that she'd come all this way, left everything behind, fought so hard to find a place where she mattered, and the first time it actually mattered, she wouldn't be enough. "Don't you die on me," she said quietly, her voice rough. "You hear me? You don't get to die." Ethan didn't answer. Lillian exhaled hard, scrubbed her hands over her face, and went back to the fire. Sometime near dawn, the wind finally began to ease. The snow still fell, but softer now, the storm losing its teeth. Lillian hadn't slept. She'd sat by the fire, feeding it, watching Ethan, her mind too loud to rest. When the first gray light filtered through the gaps in the barn walls, she stood and looked outside. The world was buried. Drifts as high as her waist, the yard unrecognizable. The outpost shed a ruin of splintered wood and broken shingles. The cabin was still standing, smoke rising from the chimney, but the path between it and the barn was completely blocked. Lillian turned back to Ethan. His breathing had steadied, just slightly. His color was still bad, but the faint blue tinge to his lips had faded. She knelt beside him, pressed her hand to his forehead. Warm. Too warm. Fever. Lillian's stomach tightened. She didn't have medicine, didn't have the supplies to treat an infection. All she had was water, fire, and stubbornness. It would have to be enough. She spent the next hour melting snow for water, soaking cloths and pressing them to Ethan's forehead, his neck, trying to bring the fever down. His body twitched under her touch, and once, he made a low, pained sound that made her chest ache. "I know," she murmured. "I know it hurts, but you're going to be fine." She didn't know if that was true. She said it anyway. By midday, the fever had worsened. Ethan's breathing turned ragged, his body trembling under the blankets. Lillian tried everything, more water, cooler cloths, shifting him onto his side when his breathing got too shallow. Nothing helped. She sat beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, and felt the heat radiating off him like a furnace. "You stubborn bastard," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't get to give up. You don't." His eyes moved under his lids, rapid and restless. His lips moved, shaping words she couldn't hear. Lillian leaned closer. "What?" "Sarah," he whispered. The name hung in the air, soft and broken. Lillian's throat tightened. She didn't know who Sarah was, but the way he said it, the pain in that single word, told her enough. "She's not here," Lillian said quietly. "But I am. And you're going to be okay." Ethan's hand twitched, reaching for something that wasn't there. Lillian took it, held it between both of hers. "I'm here," she said again. His fingers curled weakly around hers, and for a moment, his breathing eased. Then the fever pulled him under again, and he went still. Geek. The second night was worse than the first. Ethan's fever spiked, his body convulsing with chills one moment and burning the next. Lillian stayed beside him, changing the cloths, forcing water between his lips when he was conscious enough to swallow, talking to him even when he couldn't hear. She told him about the fence posts she'd fixed, the roof she'd patched, the garden she'd cleared. She told him about the mare, how the animal had carried her for 11 days without complaint. She told him things she'd never said out loud, about leaving her father's house, about the brother who'd never listened, about the years she'd spent being invisible. "I was good at it," she said, her voice hoarse. "Being quiet, being small. I thought if I just didn't ask for anything, didn't take up space, people would, I don't know, see me, maybe. But they didn't. They never did." Ethan's breathing hitched, and she paused, her hand tightening around his. "You saw me, though," she said. "You didn't want to, but you did." He didn't answer, but his hand stayed in hers. On the third day, the fever broke. Lillian woke. She'd finally dozed off sometime before dawn to find Ethan's eyes open, staring up at the rafters. His face was still pale, still drawn, but the awful heat was gone. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding. "Ethan?" His eyes shifted to her, slow and unfocused. "Where?" "The barn. You're in the barn." He blinked, confused. "Why?" "Because a tree tried to kill you, and I wasn't going to let it." His brow furrowed like he was trying to piece together something that didn't make sense. "You dragged you out of the snow, yes. Don't try to move yet. Your ribs are a mess and—" He winced, his hand going to his side. "How long?" 3 days. 3... He closed his eyes, exhaled slowly. "The storm." "Passed. Mostly." "The cabin?" "Still standing. The shed's gone, though." He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then he opened his eyes again and looked at her, really looked at her, like he was seeing her for the first time. "You pulled me out," he said. "I did." "Why?" Lillian stared at him. "What kind of question is that?" "A fair one." "You think I was just going to leave you there?" "Most people would have." "I'm not most people." Ethan's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Almost. "No," he said quietly. "You're not." He tried to sit up, and Lillian immediately pushed him back down. "Don't even think about it. You've been unconscious for 3 days with a fever that almost killed you. You're staying put. I don't take orders. You do now." They stared at each other, and for a moment Lillian thought he was going to argue. Then he sighed, winced again, and let his head fall back against the bedroll. "Fine," he muttered. "Good." She stood, ladled water from the bucket, and brought it to him. He drank slowly, his hands shaking slightly, and when he was done, he handed the cup back without looking at her. "Thank you," he said. Lillian blinked. It was the first time he'd said it. "You're welcome." Tacken. Over the next few days, Ethan's strength returned in slow, grudging increments. He could sit up without help by the 4th day, stand, barely, by the 5th. Lillian stayed close, watching him like a hawk, ready to catch him if he fell. He didn't like it. "I'm fine," he said for the 10th time, swatting her hand away as she tried to steady him. "You're not fine. You're standing like a newborn calf." "I've been worse." "I'm sure you have. Sit down before you pass out." He glared at her, but he sat. Lillian brought him food, soup she'd made from the supplies in the cabin, bread she'd somehow managed to bake in the barrel stove. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and he ate it without complaint. "You didn't have to do all this," he said one evening, watching her stoke the fire. "Yes, I did." "Why?" She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Because no one else was going to." Ethan didn't respond. He just stared into the fire, his jaw tight. After a long silence, he spoke again. "Sarah was my wife." Lillian went still. "She died 3 years ago," he continued, his voice flat, distant. "Fever. Same as almost got me. I watched her burn up from the inside, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. Lillian's throat tightened, but she didn't speak. After she was gone, I came up here, built this place. Figured if I was alone, I wouldn't have to feel it anymore. Did it work? Lillian asked quietly. Ethan's mouth twisted, for a while. And now? He looked at her, and for the first time there was something other than emptiness in his eyes. Something raw and uncertain. Now I don't know. Lillian nodded slowly. She didn't offer comfort, didn't try to fill the silence with platitudes. She just sat with him, the fire crackling between them, and let the weight of his grief exist without trying to fix it. Because some things couldn't be fixed. They could only be carried. A week after the storm, Ethan was strong enough to walk to the cabin. It took him twice as long as it should have, his body still weak, his ribs protesting every step. But he made it, and when he pushed open the door and saw the inside, clean, organized, the fire already burning, he stopped dead. What did you do? Lillian stepped past him, setting a basket of firewood by the hearth. What needed doing? I didn't ask you to. I know. He looked around, his jaw working. The floor was swept, the dishes washed, the shelves restocked. There was food on the table, bread, cheese, dried apples. Things she must have brought from the outpost supplies. You've been busy, he said. So have you, mostly bleeding and being stubborn. Ethan huffed, a sound that might have been a laugh if he'd let it. He crossed to the table, lowered himself carefully into a chair, and stared at the food. You didn't have to, he said again, quieter this time. I wanted to. Why? Lillian met his eyes. Because you let me stay. I didn't let you. You just stayed. Same thing. It wasn't, and they both knew it. But Ethan didn't argue. He just picked up a piece of bread, tore it in half, and handed one piece to her. Lillian took it. They ate in silence, the fire warm, the storm long past, and for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel quite so alone. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm, one neither of them acknowledged, but both began to depend on. Lillian still slept in the barn, Ethan insisted, though with less conviction than before, but she spent her days in and around the cabin, working. She repaired the rest of the fences, cleared snow from the paths, chopped wood until her arms ached. Ethan watched from the porch at first, still too weak to help, but eventually he joined her. They worked side by side, not talking much, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't the cold, guarded distance of those first days. It was something quieter, easier. One afternoon, Lillian was hauling water from the pump when the handle snapped clean off in her hand. She stared at it, then let out a short, sharp laugh. Of course! Ethan looked up from the wood he was stacking. Problem? She held up the broken handle. This thing's older than both of us. He walked over, took the handle from her, and turned it over in his hands. I can fix it. Can you? Probably. That's not exactly confidence-inspiring. His mouth twitched. I'll manage. He did. It took him an hour and a lot of muttered cursing, but he got the handle reattached, reinforced with wire and a strip of leather. When he was done, he worked the pump a few times and water came up clean and steady. Lillian raised an eyebrow. I'm impressed. Don't be. It'll break again in a month. Still counts. Ethan shrugged, but there was something almost pleased in the way he wiped his hands on his pants. That night, Lillian cooked dinner, beans and salt pork, nothing fancy, and they ate together at the cabin table. Ethan had stopped telling her to leave. She'd stopped pretending she would. You ever think about what you're going to do? He asked, breaking the silence. Do about what? After. After what? After this. He gestured vaguely like he didn't have words for what this was. Lillian considered. No. No? I don't plan that far ahead anymore. Ethan nodded slowly like he understood. What did you do before you came here? She hesitated, then shrugged. Whatever I was told. He waited, and when she didn't elaborate, he didn't push, just took another bite of beans and let it lie. But later, after she'd gone back to the barn and he was alone by the fire, Ethan found himself thinking about that answer. Whatever I was told. He wondered what kind of life did that to a person. What kind of people? And he wondered why it made him angry. 2 weeks after the storm, a rider came. Ethan saw him from the cabin window, a man on a dark horse, moving slow up the trail. He was dressed well, too well for Blackridge, with a heavy coat and a hat that hadn't seen much weather. Behind him, 2 more riders followed, both younger, both armed. Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew what this was. Lillian was at the pump, filling a bucket. She looked up as the riders approached, her expression wary. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, his hand resting on the rifle leaning against the wall. The lead rider stopped a dozen feet from the cabin and tipped his hat. "Mr. Vale?" Ethan didn't move. "Grayson." The man, Grayson, smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Been a while." "Not long enough." Grayson's smile widened. "Still charming as ever, I see." "What do you want?" "Just passing through. Thought I'd check in, make sure you weathered the storm all right." "We're fine." "We?" Grayson's eyes flicked to Lillian, lingering just a little too long. "Didn't know you'd taken on help." "Didn't know it was your business." "Everything up here's my business, Ethan. You know that." Ethan's hand tightened on the rifle. "What do you want, Grayson?" The man's smile faded. "I want what we talked about last year, this land. I'm willing to pay fair price, more than fair, considering what it's worth." "Not for sale." "Everything's for sale." "Not this." Grayson sighed like he was dealing with a child. "You're being unreasonable. And you're trespassing. Turn around and leave." The 2 younger men shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their guns. Grayson held up a hand, stopping them. "Easy," he said. Then to Ethan, "I'm trying to be civil here." Civil would have been not coming at all. Grayson's expression hardened. "You're sitting on prime land, Vale. Timber, water rights, access to the northern pass. I've got buyers who'd pay a fortune for it, then sell them something else. I'm trying to help you. You think you can survive up here forever? Alone, half dead from your own stubbornness?" "I'm not alone," Ethan said, his voice cold. Grayson's eyes flicked to Lillian again. She'd set the bucket down and was standing very still, her gaze locked on the men. "Her," Grayson said, his tone mocking. "That little thing? What's she gonna do?" "More than you'd expect," Ethan said. Grayson laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're a fool, Vale. This land's too much for one man, too much for 2. Sooner or later you'll break, and when you do, I'll still be here, and the price won't be as generous. Get off my property." Grayson stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but this isn't over." He turned his horse and rode off, the 2 younger men following. They disappeared down the trail, and the silence they left behind felt heavier than before. Ethan lowered the rifle, his hands shaking slightly. Lillian walked over, her face pale but calm. "Who was that?" "Trouble." "I figured that much." Ethan looked at her, and for the first time she saw real fear in his eyes. "He's going to come back," he said quietly. "I know. And next time he won't ask." Lillian held his gaze. "Then we'll be ready." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to tell her this wasn't her fight, that she should leave before it got worse. But the words wouldn't come, because somewhere in the last few weeks it had stopped being just his fight, and he didn't know when that had happened. They didn't talk about it that night, but the weight of Grayson's visit sat between them like a stone. Ethan moved through the cabin with restless energy, checking the windows, the door, the rifle above the mantel. His ribs still ached, his body still weak, but he couldn't sit still. Lillian watched him from the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "You should rest," she said finally. "I'm fine." "You're not." He stopped pacing, turned to look at her. "You don't know what he's capable of." "Then tell me." Ethan's jaw worked. He didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to give Grayson more space in his head than the man already occupied. But Lillian was watching him with that steady, unblinking gaze that made it hard to hide. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat heavily. "Maxwell Grayson," he said, the name bitter on his tongue, "runs half the territory from his estate down in Ridgemont. Timber contracts, water rights, land speculation. If it's worth money, he's got his fingers in it, and he wants your land." Has for 3 years. Ever since Sarah died and word got out I was alone up here. What's so special about it? Water, mostly. There's a spring on the north side of the property, feeds into the river that runs through the valley. Controls the spring, controls the water supply for the settlements downstream. Plus the timber. And the pass. He gestured vaguely toward the mountains. Only route through the highlands for 50 miles. Whoever owns this land controls access. Lillian frowned. So it's about power. It's always about power. And you won't sell. No. Why not? Ethan looked at her like the question didn't make sense. Because it's mine. That's not a reason. It's the only reason that matters. Lillian was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. What did he mean when he said this isn't over? Ethan exhaled slowly. Grayson doesn't take no for an answer. If he can't buy you out, he finds another way. Pressure, threats. Sometimes worse. Worse how? Accidents, fires. People who don't cooperate tend to have bad luck. Lillian's expression didn't change, but her grip on the cup tightened. You think he'd go that far? I know he would. Then why are you still here? The question hung in the air, sharp and direct. Ethan stared at her, and for a moment he didn't have an answer. Or maybe he had too many answers, all tangled up with grief and stubbornness and the kind of pride that didn't know when to quit. Because I don't run, he said finally. Lillian nodded slowly, like she'd expected that. Neither do I. Ethan studied her, this woman who'd appeared out of nowhere and refused to leave, who'd dragged him out of the snow and patched him back together and now sat across from him talking about standing her ground like it was the simplest thing in the world. This isn't your fight, he said. Yes, it is. You've been here 3 weeks, and I'm still here. You don't owe me anything. I know that. Then why? Lillian set her cup down, met his eyes. Because for the first time in my life, someone didn't tell me to leave. You let me stay. You let me work. You let me matter. Ethan's chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with his ribs. So if Grayson comes back, Lillian continued, her voice steady, he's not just coming for your land, he's coming for mine too, and I'm not giving it up without a fight. Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was being reckless, that she didn't understand what she was getting into, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She understood just fine. She just didn't care. All right, he said quietly. Lillian's mouth curved just slightly. All right. The next morning, they started preparing. Ethan made a list. Ammunition, supplies, repairs that couldn't wait. Lillian took inventory of what they had, what they needed, what could be improvised. They worked methodically, neither of them saying much, but the silence was different now. Purposeful. By midday, Ethan was standing on the porch, staring at the remains of the outpost shed. The storm had destroyed most of it, but the foundation was still solid, and the supply stock, what little had survived, was scattered but salvageable. We need to rebuild that, he said. Lillian came to stand beside him, her arms crossed against the cold. How long will it take? A week, maybe 2. If we had help, less. We don't have help. No. She looked at the wreckage, then at him. Then we'd better get started. They spent the rest of the day clearing debris, sorting through broken boards and bent nails, salvaging what they could. It was slow, brutal work, and by the time the sun set, Ethan's ribs were screaming and Lillian's hands were raw despite the gloves. But they'd made progress. That night Ethan sat by the fire, his body aching, and watched Lillian move around the cabin. She'd taken over cooking without asking, and he'd stopped protesting. She wasn't good at it, the beans were overcooked, the bread a little too dense, but it was warm, and it filled the hollow space in his stomach. You don't have to do this, he said, as she set a plate in front of him. We've been over this. I know, but I'm saying it anyway. She sat across from him, picked up her fork. You're wasting your breath. Probably. They ate in silence, and when they were done, Lillian cleared the plates and washed them in the basin. Ethan watched her, this strange, stubborn woman who'd walked into his life uninvited and refused to leave. Where did you learn to work like that? He asked. She glanced over her shoulder. Like what? Like you've been doing it your whole life. Lillian dried her hands on a towel, her expression unreadable. My father had an estate. Horses, land, workers. I wasn't supposed to do the work, just watch it get done. But I hated sitting still, so I learned. Fixed fences, mucked stalls, hauled water, drove my mother crazy. Why? Because it wasn't proper, wasn't ladylike. She said the word like it tasted bad. Women in my family were supposed to be decorative, quiet, useful only in the ways that didn't require dirt under their nails. And you weren't. No. What happened? Lillian was quiet for a long moment, her hand still on the towel. I got tired of pretending, so I left. Just like that? Just like that. Ethan nodded slowly. He understood that kind of leaving, the kind where you didn't look back because looking back meant questioning, and questioning meant doubt, and doubt meant going back to the thing that was killing you slowly. Do you regret it? He asked. Lillian turned to face him, her eyes steady. No. Not even a little? Not even a little. Ethan believed her. 3 days later, they were halfway through rebuilding the shed when the first warning came. Ethan was on the roof hammering down shingles when he heard the sharp crack of a rifle shot. It wasn't close, maybe a quarter-mile off, but it was deliberate. A warning, not a threat. He froze, hammer in hand, and looked toward the tree line. Lillian was on the ground, hauling boards. She looked up, her face pale. Was that? Yeah. Another shot, closer this time. Ethan climbed down fast, his ribs protesting, and grabbed the rifle from where it leaned against the cabin wall. Lillian was already moving toward the barn, her steps quick and purposeful. Stay inside, Ethan said. Like hell. Lillian, I'm not hiding. He didn't have time to argue. A third shot rang out, and this time he saw the flash, up in the rocks above the property line. One shooter, maybe two. Ethan raised the rifle, sighted, and fired a warning shot of his own. The echo rolled across the valley, sharp and clear. Silence. Then, from the rocks, a voice called out, "Just a reminder, Vale, time's running out." Ethan's jaw clenched. He didn't answer. The voice laughed, and then there was the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. Ethan lowered the rifle, his hands shaking slightly. Lillian came to stand beside him, her face grim. "They're not going to stop," she said. "No. What do we do?" Ethan looked at her, then at the half-finished shed, the cabin, the land that stretched out around them. He thought about Grayson, about the men with guns, about the fight he knew was coming. He thought about Sarah, buried 3 years now, and the promise he'd made to himself never to let anyone take what was his. "We finish the shed," he said. "We stock up, and we wait." For what? For them to make their move. Lillian nodded, her expression hard. And then? Then we make ours. They worked faster after that, driven by urgency and the knowledge that time was running out. The shed went up in 4 days instead of a week, rough but functional. They reinforced the cabin door, checked the windows, stocked ammunition in places where it could be reached quickly. Ethan taught Lillian to shoot. She'd never held a rifle before, and the first few attempts were shaky, her shots going wide. But she learned fast, her hand steadying, her aim improving with each round. By the end of the second day, she could hit a target at 50 yards. "Not bad," Ethan said, watching her reload. "Not good either." "Good enough." She glanced at him, her mouth quirking. "You don't set a high bar." "Bar's not the point. Point is survival." Lillian lined up another shot, exhaled, and fired. The target splintered dead center. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Okay, that's better than good enough." She smiled, just a little, and the sight of it did something strange to his chest. A week passed, then 2. No more shots, no more warnings, but the silence was worse than the threats. It felt like waiting for a storm you could see on the horizon but couldn't outrun. Ethan spent the time working, chopping wood, checking traps, repairing anything that looked weak. Lillian matched him step for step, her presence steady and constant. They didn't talk much, but the quiet between them had shifted again, softened into something that felt almost like trust. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Lillian spoke. "Tell me about her." Ethan looked up. "Who?" "Sarah." He went still, his hand tightening around the cup he was holding. Why? Because you loved her, and because she's part of why you're still here. Ethan stared into the fire, his jaw working. He didn't talk about Sarah. Hadn't in 3 years. Talking about her made her real again, and real meant the grief came back, sharp and fresh. But Lillian was watching him with that quiet, patient expression, and somehow the words came. She was fierce, he said finally. Stubborn, laughed too loud, burned everything she cooked. His mouth twitched, almost a smile. She hated the cold. Hated this place, actually, but she came anyway because I asked her to. Did she ever regret it? I don't know. Maybe. He paused, his voice dropping. The fever hit her fast. One day she was fine, the next she couldn't get out of bed. I tried everything, cold water, herbs, blankets, nothing worked. She lasted 4 days. Lillian's expression softened, but she didn't interrupt. When she died, I told myself I was done. Done caring, done needing anyone. Figured if I stayed alone, I couldn't lose anyone else. Did it work? Ethan looked at her, and the answer caught in his throat. Because no, it hadn't worked. He'd tried so damn hard to bury everything, to build walls high enough that nothing could get through. But this woman, this stranger who'd refused to leave, had gotten through anyway. And he didn't know what to do about that. No, he said quietly. It didn't. Lillian nodded like she'd expected that answer. She didn't say anything else, just sat with him in the firelight, and for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel quite so hollow. Check. The attack came on a Tuesday. Ethan was in the barn, checking the mare's hooves, when he heard the sound of horses. A lot of them. He straightened, his stomach dropping, and moved to the door. 6 riders. Maybe 7. All armed. Grayson was at the front, sitting tall in his saddle, his expression calm and cold. Behind him, his men fanned out, surrounding the property. Ethan grabbed the rifle and stepped outside. Lillian was already on the porch, her own rifle in hand, her face pale, but set. Grayson smiled when he saw them. Mr. Vale. Miss... He paused, like he was waiting for her to fill in the blank. When she didn't, he shrugged. I gave you time, more than enough. Now I'm here to collect. This land's not for sale, Ethan said, his voice hard. I'm not buying anymore. Grayson gestured, and 2 of his men dismounted, pulling out a rolled document. I'm taking. Legal claim, signed by the territorial magistrate. You've been declared absent from your holdings. Property reverts to the territorial trust, which I happen to represent. That's a lie. It's paperwork. Same thing. Ethan's hands tightened on the rifle. Get off my land. Grayson sighed like he was dealing with a particularly slow child. You don't seem to understand. This isn't your land anymore. It's mine. You've got 1 hour to pack your things and leave. After that, my men will help you. You think I'm just going to walk away? I think you're smart enough to know when you're beaten. Ethan raised the rifle, sighted on Grayson's chest. I'm not beaten. The men behind Grayson shifted, hands moving to their guns. The air went tight, charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. Grayson's smile faded. You're making a mistake, Vale. Wouldn't be the first time. You're one man. You can't win this. He's not alone, Lillian said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Grayson's eyes flicked to her, dismissive. You! What are you going to do, sweetheart? Lillian didn't flinch. More than you think. Grayson laughed, but it sounded forced. This is your last chance. Walk away, and no one gets hurt. No, Ethan said. Then you're a fool. Grayson raised his hand, and his men started to move forward. That's when Lillian fired. The shot cracked through the air, and one of Grayson's men yelped, his hat flying off his head. The horses reared, startled, and the men scrambled to control them. Lillian lowered the rifle, her expression cold. Next one's not a warning. Grayson stared at her, his face flushed with anger. You just made a very big mistake. Guess I'm a fool too, she said. Ethan couldn't help it. He almost smiled. Grayson's hand dropped, and his men drew their guns. But before anyone could fire, Lillian stepped forward, her voice ringing out clear and sharp. You want this land? Fine, but you're going to have to take it, and I guarantee you it's going to cost more than you're willing to pay. Grayson's eyes narrowed. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Lillian's mouth curved, sharp, and humorless. I know you're counting on him being alone, weak, easy to push around, but he's not alone, and neither am I. Who the hell are you? Someone who's tired of men like you taking what isn't yours. Grayson stared at her, his jaw tight. Then he looked at Ethan, at the rifle still trained on his chest, and made a calculation. He pulled his horse back. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I know, Lillian said. Grayson turned his horse and rode off, his men following. They disappeared down the trail, and the silence they left behind was deafening. Ethan lowered the rifle, his hands shaking. Lillian was still standing on the porch, her rifle at her side, her face pale but steady. You okay? He asked. No, she said, but I will be. Ethan crossed to her, and for a moment they just stood there, side by side, staring at the empty trail. That was reckless, he said finally. I know. You could have gotten yourself killed. So could you. That's different. Why? Because you've been alone longer? Ethan didn't have an answer for that. Lillian looked at him, her eyes fierce. I meant what I said. This is my fight too. I know. Do you? He met her gaze and something passed between them, something unspoken but understood. Yeah, he said quietly. I do. Lillian nodded, then turned and walked back into the cabin. Ethan stayed on the porch, staring out at the valley, his mind racing. Grayson would come back. That much was certain. And next time he wouldn't come with words and paperwork. He'd come with fire. Armored socket. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, turning over the day's events in his mind, trying to figure out what came next. Grayson had legal paperwork, fraudulent probably, but legal enough that the law wouldn't help. And even if it would, the nearest lawman was 3 days' ride away. They were on their own. The door creaked open, and Lillian stepped inside, wrapped in a blanket. She'd been sleeping in the barn again, but Ethan had stopped arguing about it. Can't sleep either? She asked. No? She crossed to the fire, sat down beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Lillian said, We're going to lose, aren't we? Ethan looked at her, surprised by the bluntness. Probably. Then why are we fighting? Because it's ours. That's not enough. It is for me. Lillian was quiet, her eyes on the flames. When I left my father's house, I didn't have a plan. I just knew I couldn't stay. Couldn't keep being the person they wanted me to be. So I left, and I rode, and I kept riding until I found a place where no one knew me. Where I could be something else. And you found this place. I found you. Ethan's chest tightened. I'm not going to let Grayson take that away, Lillian said, her voice steady. I'm not going back to being invisible, to being nothing. You're not nothing. I know, but I didn't know that before I came here. Ethan stared at her, at the firelight reflecting in her eyes, and realized something. He'd spent 3 years convincing himself he didn't need anyone. That being alone was safer, easier, better. But he'd been wrong, because this, sitting by the fire with someone who understood, who fought beside him, who didn't flinch, this was better, and he didn't want to lose it. We'll figure it out, he said. How? I don't know yet, but we will. Lillian looked at him, and for the first time she smiled, a real smile, small but genuine. Okay, she said, and somehow that was enough. Morning came too early, the sky still gray and reluctant when Ethan stepped outside. He'd slept maybe 2 hours, his mind too loud to rest. Lillian was already awake, standing by the pump with a bucket of water, her breath misting in the cold air. She looked up when she heard him. You look terrible. Thanks. I mean it. You need to rest. Can't. Why not? Because Grayson's coming back, and when he does, I need to be ready. Lillian set the bucket down, wiped her hands on her coat. We need to be ready. Ethan nodded, too tired to argue. Yeah, They spent the morning going over the property line by line, looking for weak points, places where Grayson's men could get through. The northern fence was solid, reinforced just last week. The eastern side butted up against the ridge, too steep for horses. But the southern approach was wide open, and the western edge had gaps where the trees had been cleared for timber. We need to block those gaps, Ethan said, pointing. Pile rocks, fallen branches, anything that'll slow them down. What about the cabin? Reinforce the door. Board up the windows we don't need for shooting. Lillian looked at him, her expression tight. You really think it's going to come to that? I think Grayson's done talking. So are we. They worked through the day, hauling rocks and logs, stacking them in makeshift barriers along the western edge. It was brutal work, and by midday Ethan's ribs were screaming, and his hands were bleeding through the calluses. But he didn't stop. Lillian matched him, lifting stones that should have been too heavy for her, dragging logs that left splinters in her palms. She didn't complain, didn't slow down, just worked with a quiet, furious determination that made Ethan's chest ache in ways that had nothing to do with his injuries. You don't have to kill yourself over this, he said as she dropped another rock onto the pile. Neither do you. It's my land. And it's my fight. We've been over this. Ethan wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him. So he just nodded and went back to work. By sunset, they'd built 3 barriers along the western edge, each one waist-high and thick enough to stop a horse. It wasn't a fortress, but it was something. They stood together, looking at their work, and Ethan felt a strange flicker of pride, not just in the barriers, but in the fact that they'd built them together. It's not much, Lillian said. It's enough. She glanced at him, her mouth quirking. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true. That night, they ate in silence, both too exhausted to talk. Lillian had made stew again, better this time, the meat tender, the broth thick. Ethan ate 2 bowls and didn't realize until he was done that she'd only had 1. You need to eat, he said. I did. Not enough. I'm fine. Lillian, I said I'm fine. Her tone was sharp, final, and Ethan recognized it for what it was, the same tone he used when he didn't want to be pushed, so he let it go. But later, when she wasn't looking, he set aside extra bread and dried meat where she'd find it in the morning. 3 days passed. Then 4. No sign of Grayson, no riders, no warnings, just silence. It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. The quiet felt wrong, like the air before a landslide. Ethan spent the time checking and rechecking their defenses, cleaning the rifles, counting ammunition. They had enough for a fight, but not a long one. If Grayson brought more men than last time, they'd be outnumbered 5-1, maybe worse. What if we left? Lillian asked one evening. Ethan looked up from where he was oiling the rifle. What? What if we just left, packed up, headed north, started somewhere else? You mean run? I mean survive. Ethan set the rifle down, his jaw tight. I don't run. I know, but maybe you should. Why? So Grayson wins? So you don't die. The words hung in the air, blunt and raw. Ethan stared at her, and for the first time he saw real fear in her eyes. Not for herself, but for him. I'm not leaving, he said quietly. Even if it kills you. Even then, Lillian's hands clenched in her lap. That's stupid. Probably. Sarah wouldn't want this. Ethan went still. Don't. Don't what? Say her name? Say the truth? You didn't know her. No, but I know you. And I know you're holding on to this place because letting go feels like losing her all over again. Ethan's chest tightened, anger and grief tangling together in a knot he couldn't untie. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Lillian's voice was steady, unrelenting. You built this place with her. She died here. And now you think if you leave, you're abandoning her. But Ethan, she's gone. She's been gone for 3 years. And you staying here getting yourself killed, that's not honoring her. That's just you being too scared to move on. The words hit like a fist to the gut. Ethan stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Get out, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Lillian didn't move. No. I said get out. And I said no. They stared at each other, the air between them crackling with tension. Ethan's hands were shaking, his breath coming fast and shallow. He wanted to yell, wanted to throw something, wanted to do anything to make the truth in her words stop echoing in his head. But he couldn't, because she was right. He sat back down, his head in his hands. Lillian was quiet for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice softer. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because I don't want to watch you die for the wrong reasons. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes burning. Then what's the right reason? I don't know, but it's not guilt, and it's not grief. Then what is it? Lillian met his gaze, and something shifted in her expression, something vulnerable and honest. Maybe it's because you finally have something worth staying for. Not the land, not the memory. Something real. Ethan's throat tightened. Like what? She didn't answer, just looked at him, and the weight of everything unsaid settled between them like a stone. Finally, Ethan exhaled, long and slow. I don't know how to let go, he said quietly. You don't have to. Not all at once. What if I can't? Then we'll figure it out. Together. Ethan stared at her, this woman who'd walked into his life uninvited and refused to leave, who'd saved him and challenged him and made him feel things he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten they existed. Why are you still here? He asked, his voice rough. Because I don't have anywhere else to be. That's not true. It is. Before I came here, I was just existing, going through the motions, being whoever people wanted me to be. But here, with you, I get to be myself. And I'm not giving that up. Not for Grayson, not for anyone. Ethan's chest ached, but it wasn't from his ribs. It was something deeper, something he didn't have words for. I don't deserve that, he said. Maybe not, but you've got it anyway. They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. And for the first time in 3 years, Ethan felt something other than emptiness. He felt hope. Well, the attack came 2 nights later. Ethan woke to the smell of smoke. He bolted upright, his heart pounding, and stumbled to the window. Outside, the western barrier was burning, flames licking up the stacked logs and spreading fast. Lillian! She was already moving, pulling on her boots, grabbing her rifle. I see it! They ran outside together. The fire was spreading toward the cabin, the heat intense even from a distance. And beyond the flames, silhouetted against the orange glow, were riders. 7 of them, maybe 8. Grayson was at the front, sitting tall in his saddle, his face calm and cold. Last chance, Vale, he shouted over the roar of the fire. Walk away or burn with it. Ethan raised his rifle, sighted on Grayson. Go to hell. Grayson smiled. Have it your way. He raised his hand and his men charged. Ethan fired. The shot caught one of the riders in the shoulder, and the man fell from his horse with a scream. Lillian fired next, her shot going wide but close enough to spook another horse. The animal reared, throwing its rider, but there were too many of them. The men spread out, circling the cabin, firing as they rode. Bullets slammed into the walls, splintered the porch rail. Ethan ducked behind the water trough, reloaded, and fired again. Another man went down. Lillian was on the porch, her rifle steady despite the chaos. She fired, reloaded, fired again, each shot deliberate and calm. One of Grayson's men got too close, and she shot his horse out from under him. The animal went down hard, and the man scrambled away, cursing. Fall back, Ethan shouted. They retreated into the cabin, slamming the door and barring it. Outside, the fire was spreading, the smoke thick and choking. Ethan moved to the window, smashed out the glass with the rifle butt, and took aim. Lillian was at the other window, her face pale but focused. How many left? 4, maybe 5. We can't hold them off forever. I know. A bullet slammed through the door, splintering the wood. Another hit the window frame, showering them with splinters. Ethan fired back, his shot hitting one of the riders in the chest. The man fell and didn't get up. But the fire was getting closer. The heat was unbearable now, the smoke pouring through the broken windows. Ethan's eyes were streaming, his lungs burning. Beside him, Lillian was coughing, her rifle shaking in her hands. We have to get out, she said, her voice hoarse. Not yet. Ethan, not yet. He fired again, and another rider went down, but there were still 3 left, and they were closing in. That's when Lillian stood. What are you doing? Ethan shouted. Ending this! Before he could stop her, she threw open the door and stepped out onto the porch. Lillian, no! But she was already moving, her rifle raised, her voice cutting through the chaos. Grayson! The riders pulled up short, startled. Grayson turned his horse, his eyes narrowing when he saw her. You want this land? She shouted. Then come and take it yourself. No men, no guns, just you. Grayson laughed. You're out of your mind. Maybe, but I'm also the only thing standing between you and what you want. So either you face me or you turn around and leave, because I'm not moving. Ethan stumbled to the door, his heart in his throat. Lillian, get back inside. She didn't look at him. No. Grayson studied her, his expression unreadable. Then he dismounted, pulled a pistol from his belt, and walked toward the cabin. Fine, he said. Let's finish this. Lillian stepped off the porch, her rifle steady. Ethan's blood ran cold. Lillian, don't... But it was too late. Grayson raised his pistol, and Lillian fired. The shot caught him in the leg, and he went down with a howl. His gun fell from his hand, skittering across the dirt. Lillian stepped forward, her rifle trained on his chest. Get off this land, she said, her voice like iron, and don't come back. Grayson stared up at her, his face twisted with pain and rage. You think this is over? You think... Lillian fired again, the bullet kicking up dirt an inch from his head. I said leave. For a long moment, Grayson didn't move. Then he pushed himself up, limping, and gestured to his men. Fall back. They hesitated, but Grayson's glare was enough. They turned their horses and rode off, leaving Grayson to stumble after them. Lillian stood there, watching them go, her rifle still raised. Ethan came up beside her, his hands shaking. You could have been killed. So could you. That's not the same. Yes, it is. She lowered the rifle, her face pale and streaked with soot. It's over. For now. For good. Lillian turned to him, her eyes fierce. I'm done being afraid, done letting people like him take what's mine. This land, this life, it's ours. And I'm not giving it up. Ethan stared at her, and for the first time he saw her not as the woman who'd stumbled into his life, but as the woman who'd fought beside him, who'd stood her ground when he'd been too weak to stand his own, who'd saved him in more ways than one. Ours, he repeated quietly. Yeah, ours. And in that moment, with the fire still burning and the smoke still thick, Ethan realized something. He wasn't alone anymore, and he didn't want to be. They spent the rest of the night putting out the fire, hauling water from the pump, beating back the flames before they could reach the cabin. By dawn, the barriers were charred and smoldering, but the cabin was intact. They collapsed on the porch, too exhausted to move, their faces black with soot, their hands blistered and raw. We did it, Lillian said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yeah. You think he'll come back? No. How do you know? Ethan looked at her, at the determination in her eyes, the strength in the set of her jaw. Because you terrified him. Lillian laughed, a short, breathless sound. Good. They sat in silence, watching the sun rise over the valley, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and pink. It was beautiful, and for the first time in years, Ethan let himself feel it. What now? Lillian asked. I don't know. You always say that. Because it's always true. She smiled just a little. We should probably rebuild the barriers. Probably. And fix the door. Yeah. And I need to move out of the barn. Ethan looked at her, his heart skipping. What? Lillian met his eyes, her expression steady. I'm tired of sleeping in the cold, and you have a perfectly good cabin with a perfectly good fireplace. So unless you're going to tell me I'm not welcome... You're welcome, Ethan said quickly. Good. She stood, brushed the soot off her coat, and headed inside. Ethan sat there for a moment longer, staring at the door she'd just walked through, and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Peace. The days that followed were different. Lillian moved her things into the cabin, and Ethan didn't protest. She took the small room in the back, the one he'd used for storage, and made it hers. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and it was safe, and it was enough. They fell into a new rhythm, one that felt less like survival and more like living. They rebuilt the barriers together, stronger this time, fixed the door, patched the bullet holes, restocked the supplies. And in the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked. Not about the past, not about what had been lost. About the future. About what they were building. One night, Ethan asked, "What made you leave? Really?" Lillian was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. "I was at a dinner party. My father had invited some business associates, and I was supposed to sit there and smile and be decorative. One of the men, older, wealthy, asked my father if I was spoken for, and my father said no, not yet, but he was open to offers." Ethan's jaw tightened. He was selling you, essentially. "What did you do?" "I left. That night. Didn't pack, didn't say goodbye. Just took what I could carry and rode." "And you ended up here." "I ended up with you." Ethan looked at her, and the firelight caught in her eyes, turning them gold. "You ever regret it?" "No." "Not even when Grayson's men were shooting at you?" She smiled. "Not even then." Ethan shook his head, amazed. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the craziest." "Probably both." They sat in comfortable silence, and Ethan realized that this quiet, easy companionship was what he'd been missing. Not just someone to share the work, but someone to share the quiet moments in between. "Thank you," he said. Lillian looked at him, surprised. "For what?" "For staying." Her expression softened. "Thank you for letting me." Winter deepened, and with it came the kind of cold that made your bones ache. But the cabin was warm, the supplies were stocked, and for the first time in years, Ethan wasn't dreading the long, dark months ahead. He and Lillian worked together, chopping wood, checking traps, maintaining the property. And in the evenings, they cooked together, ate together, sat by the fire together. It was simple, uncomplicated, and it was everything. One night as they were cleaning up after dinner, Lillian spoke. "I've been thinking." "About?" "The garden. Come spring, we should expand it. Plant more vegetables, maybe some herbs." "We?" She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Unless you don't want—" "I want," Ethan said quickly. I didn't think you'd still be here." "Where else would I be?" "I don't know, somewhere warmer, somewhere easier." Lillian shook her head. "I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for home." Ethan's chest tightened. "And this is it?" She met his eyes, and the answer was there before she spoke. "Yeah, this is it." Ethan didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to put into words the way her presence had changed everything, had taken the hollow, broken shell of his life and filled it with something real. So he didn't say anything. He just reached across the table and took her hand. Lillian's fingers curled around his, warm and steady, and they sat there in the firelight, holding on to each other and the life they were building together. A week later, Ethan was outside splitting wood when he saw a rider approaching. His hand went instinctively to the rifle, but then he recognized the horse. It was old Carver, the trapper, riding slow and easy up the trail. Ethan set the axe down and waited. Carver pulled up, tipping his hat. "Ethan?" "Carver." "Heard you had some trouble." "Word travels fast." "Always does." Carver dismounted, his movements stiff. "Heard you sent Grayson packing. That true?" "More or less." "Good. Man's a snake." Carver glanced toward the cabin where Lillian was visible through the window. "That your wife?" Ethan hesitated. "No, she's a friend." Huh?" Carver's mouth twitched. "Friend who shoots like that, you better hold on to her." "I'm trying." Carver laughed, a rough, wheezing sound. "Well, I just came by to say congratulations. And to let you know Grayson's left the territory, took his men and his schemes and headed east. Word is his backers pulled out after he came back empty-handed and shot up." Ethan's eyebrows rose. "He's gone?" "For good, looks like." Relief washed over him, so sudden and overwhelming he had to sit down. "He's really gone." "Seems like it. You're in the clear, Ethan." Ethan looked toward the cabin where Lillian was moving around inside and felt something settle in his chest. It was over. Really over. "Thank you," he said. Carver waved him off. "Don't mention it. Just keep that land safe, and that woman too." He mounted up and rode off, leaving Ethan standing in the yard, staring at the cabin. When he went inside, Lillian looked up from where she was kneading bread. "Who was that?" "Carver." Came to tell me Grayson's gone. Left the territory. Lillian went still. Gone. Yeah. She set the dough down, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked at him with wide eyes. It's over? It's over. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Lillian crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him. Ethan froze, startled, then slowly, carefully, he put his arms around her. She was warm and solid and real, and holding her felt like coming home. We did it, she whispered against his shoulder. Yeah, Ethan said, his voice rough. We did. They stood there for a long time, holding on to each other, and Ethan realized that this quiet, imperfect, hard-won life was more than he'd ever thought he'd have again. And he wasn't letting it go. They didn't let go right away. Ethan held Lillian for longer than he probably should have, feeling the warmth of her against his chest, the steady rhythm of her breathing. When they finally pulled apart, there was a moment where their eyes met, and neither of them knew quite what to say. Lillian cleared her throat, stepped back, brushed her hands on her apron. I should finish the bread. Yeah, and I've got wood to split. And They moved apart, back to their separate tasks, but something had shifted. The air felt different, charged with something neither of them was ready to name. That night they sat by the fire as usual, but the silence between them wasn't quite as comfortable as before. It was heavier, full of words that neither of them spoke. Finally, Lillian broke it. What are you going to do now? Ethan looked up from the cup he'd been staring into. What do you mean? Grayson's gone. The threat's over. You can, I don't know, live your life without looking over your shoulder, I guess. You don't sound happy about it. I am. It's just... He paused, searching for words. I've spent 3 years fighting, first against the grief, then against being alone, then against Grayson. Now that there's nothing left to fight, I don't know what to do with myself. Lillian nodded slowly. I know the feeling. Yeah, I spent 28 years fighting to be seen, to matter. And now that I'm here, now that I do matter, it's strange. Like I don't quite believe it's real. Ethan looked at her, at the way the firelight caught in her dark hair, the set of her jaw, the quiet strength in her eyes. It's real. How do you know? Because you're still here. Because you chose to stay. That's as real as it gets. Lillian's expression softened, and for a moment Ethan thought she might cry. But she didn't. She just nodded, picked up her cup, and took a sip. They sat in silence after that, but it was the good kind again. The kind that didn't need filling. Well, winter began to loosen its grip slowly, reluctantly. The snow didn't melt all at once. It retreated inch by inch, leaving patches of brown earth and dead grass in its wake. The days grew longer, the light softer, and the air carried the faint promise of something new. Ethan felt it too. A lightness he hadn't experienced in years, like a weight he'd been carrying had finally been set down. He and Lillian worked side by side, preparing for spring. They cleared the garden plot, turning over the frozen soil, pulling out the last of the dead weeds. Lillian had ideas, lots of them, about what they should plant, how they should organize the rows, where to put the herb bed. Tomatoes here, she said, pointing. Beans along this side, potatoes in the back. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You've given this a lot of thought. I like planning. I've noticed. She shot him a look, but there was humor in it. You got a problem with that? No, just surprised. Why? Because when you showed up, you looked like you didn't have a plan at all. Lillian smiled, but it was tinged with something sad. I didn't. I just knew I had to leave. Everything after that was improvised. Worked out pretty well. Did it? Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she was serious. She still wasn't sure. Still didn't quite believe that this life, this place, was hers to keep. Yeah, he said quietly. It did. Lillian held his gaze for a moment, then turned back to the garden plot, her cheeks faintly flushed. They worked in silence after that, but it was a good silence, the kind that felt like companionship. One afternoon, Ethan was repairing the porch rail when Lillian came out carrying 2 cups of coffee. Thought you could use a break, she said, handing him one. Thanks. They sat together on the steps, looking out over the valley. The snow was almost gone now, the trees starting to bud, the the grass turning green in patches. It was still cold, but the edge had dulled. "You ever think about what comes next?" Lillian asked. Ethan took a sip of coffee. "Like what?" "I don't know. The future. What this place could be." "What do you mean?" Lillian gestured toward the outpost shed, still standing but battered. "We could rebuild that, make it bigger, stock more supplies, maybe even start trading with the settlements downstream." Ethan looked at her, surprised. "You want to run a trading post?" "Why not? We've got the location, the spring, the pass. People need those things, and we could use the income. We're doing fine. For now. But what about next winter, or the one after that?" Ethan was quiet, considering. He'd never thought past survival, never let himself imagine a future that involved growth, expansion, something more than just getting by. But Lillian was right. They had the resources, and more importantly, they had each other. "You really think we could do it?" he asked. "I think we can do anything." There was a confidence in her voice that made Ethan's chest tighten. Not arrogance, just certainty. The kind that came from someone who'd already survived the worst and come out stronger. "All right," he said. Lillian blinked. "All right?" "Yeah, let's do it." A smile spread across her face, slow and genuine, and Ethan felt something shift inside him. Something that felt dangerously close to happiness. They spent the next few weeks planning, sketching out ideas on scraps of paper, arguing good-naturedly about details. Lillian wanted the trading post to have a separate room for dry goods, another for tools, and a counter near the front for transactions. Ethan thought they should focus on durability first, aesthetics later. "People don't care what it looks like if the roof's falling in," he said. "People care more than you think. Presentation matters." "Since when?" "Since always. You think I showed up here looking like I didn't care? I made sure I looked capable, even when I was half dead from the cold." Ethan stared at her. "You planned that?" "Of course I did. First impressions matter." He shook his head, amazed. "You're something else." "I'll take that as a compliment." It was meant as one. Their eyes met, and for a moment the air between them felt charged again. Then Lillian cleared her throat and looked away. "We should start clearing the site tomorrow," she said. "Yeah, tomorrow." But tomorrow came and went, and they kept finding reasons to delay. The weather turned rainy, the ground too muddy to work. Then Ethan's ribs started aching again, a reminder that he still wasn't fully healed. Then Lillian caught a cold and spent 3 days in bed, stubborn and miserable. Ethan made her soup, the way she'd done for him. It wasn't great, too salty, the vegetables overcooked, but she ate it anyway. "This is terrible," she said, her voice hoarse. "I know. Why are you smiling?" "Because you're eating it anyway." Lillian tried to glare at him, but it turned into a cough. Ethan handed her a blanket, and she pulled it around her shoulders, shivering. "You don't have to take care of me," she said. "I know." "Then why are you?" Ethan sat down in his chair beside her bed, his expression serious. "Because you took care of me. Because you stayed when you didn't have to. Because..." He paused, searching for the right words. "Because I want to." Lillian's eyes softened, and for a moment she looked like she might cry. But then she just nodded, pulled the blanket tighter, and closed her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan stayed with her until she fell asleep, then quietly slipped out of the room. Cheers. By the time Lillian recovered, spring had fully arrived. The valley was green, the air warm, and the world felt alive in a way it hadn't in months. They started work on the trading post, clearing the debris from the old shed, salvaging what they could, hauling in new timber from the woods. It was hard work, the kind that left them both exhausted and sore, but it felt good. Productive. Like they were building something that would last. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Lillian spoke. "I never thanked you." Ethan looked at her. "For what?" "For letting me stay, for trusting me, for giving me a chance when you didn't have to. You earned it." "Did I?" "Yeah, you did." Lillian was quiet for a moment, then she turned to face him. "I need to tell you something." Ethan's stomach tightened. "What?" "When I left my father's house, I didn't just leave. I stole money. Not a lot, but enough. And I lied about where I was going. Told them I was visiting a cousin in Charleston. By the time they realized I was gone, I was 3 days ahead of them. Ethan frowned. Why are you telling me this? Because I don't want there to be secrets between us. And because I want you to know who I really am. Not the person I pretended to be when I showed up here. The real me. Ethan studied her, this woman who'd fought beside him, who'd saved his life, who'd stood her ground against Grayson and his men without flinching. I already know who you are, he said quietly. Do you? Yeah. You're Lillian Cross. You're stubborn, fearless, and terrible at cooking. You work harder than anyone I've ever met, and you don't quit. Ever. That's who you are. Lillian's eyes glistened, and she looked away quickly, blinking hard. That's not all I am, she said, her voice rough. I know, but it's enough. She looked back at him, and the vulnerability in her expression made his chest ache. You really mean that? Yeah, I do. Lillian exhaled slowly, and some of the tension left her shoulders. Okay. They sat in silence, watching the last of the light fade from the sky, and Ethan realized something. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. Yeah. The trading post took shape slowly over the next month. The walls went up first, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. Then the roof, angled steep to shed snow. Then the shelves, the counter, the door. Lillian insisted on painting a sign. Ethan thought it was unnecessary, but he helped her anyway, holding the board steady while she carefully lettered the words Vale and Cross on Trading Post. Vale and Cross, he said, raising an eyebrow. You got a problem with that? No, just didn't think what? Ethan hesitated, then shrugged. Didn't think you'd want your name on it. Why wouldn't I? Because it's my land. Lillian set down the brush, her expression serious. Is it? What do you mean? I mean, is it just your land, or is it ours? Ethan stared at her, and the question hung in the air between them, heavy and significant. I don't know, he said honestly. What do you want it to be? Lillian met his eyes, and something passed between them, something unspoken but understood. Ours, she said quietly. Ethan's throat tightened. Yeah? Yeah. He nodded slowly, and a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Okay then, Vale and Cross it is. Lillian smiled back, and they finished the sign together. Basimet. The first customer arrived on a Tuesday in late April. Ethan was inside the trading post, organizing inventory, when he heard the sound of hoofbeats. He looked up to see a young man riding a bay horse, a pack mule trailing behind him. The man dismounted, looked at the sign, then at Ethan. You open? We are. Good. I need flour, salt, and ammunition. And if you got coffee, I'll take that too. Ethan gathered the supplies while the man browsed. Lillian came in a few minutes later carrying a basket of vegetables from the garden, and the man's eyes widened. You grew these up here? We did, Lillian said. How much for a dozen? $2. Deal. They made the sale, and the man rode off, looking pleased. Ethan and Lillian stood in the doorway, watching him go. That was easy, Lillian said. Yeah. Think we'll get more? Probably. And they did. Word spread quickly that there was a new trading post at the Northern Pass, run by a man and woman who were fair, honest, and well-stocked. Within a month, they were seeing customers every few days. Trappers, prospectors, settlers heading north. All of them needing supplies, all of them willing to pay. The money wasn't much at first, but it added up. Enough to buy more inventory, to expand the garden, to start thinking about the future in concrete terms. One evening, Lillian sat at the table counting coins, her brow furrowed in concentration. We did well this month, she said. How well? Well enough to buy a second horse, maybe even a cow. Ethan leaned back in his chair, impressed. You've got a head for this. Someone has to. I'm not arguing. Lillian looked up, her eyes bright. We're actually doing it, Ethan. We're building something. Yeah, we are. She smiled, and Ethan felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the one that had started the day she'd pulled him out of the snow and hadn't let go since. He was falling for her, No, that wasn't right. He'd already fallen. He just hadn't admitted it yet. Summer arrived hot and bright, and the valley bloomed. The garden flourished, the trading post thrived, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he had a purpose beyond survival. But with the good came the inevitable complications. One afternoon, a woman arrived at the trading post, older, sharp-eyed, with a way of looking at people that made them feel measured and found wanting. "I'm looking for Lillian Cross," she said. Ethan's stomach dropped. "Who's asking?" "Her aunt, Margaret Cross." Lillian appeared in the doorway, her face going pale. "Aunt Margaret?" The woman's expression didn't soften. "So it's true. You're here. How did you find me?" "Your father hired investigators. Took them 6 months, but they tracked you to this godforsaken place." She looked around, her lip curling. "This is where you've been hiding?" "I'm not hiding." "Then what do you call it?" "Living." Margaret's eyes flicked to Ethan, then back to Lillian. "Living with him? In sin?" Lillian's jaw tightened. "It's not like that." "Isn't it?" "No. Ethan gave me a place to stay when I had nowhere else to go. He didn't ask questions, didn't judge. He just let me be. And now you're playing house in the wilderness. Your father is ashamed. Your mother is heartbroken. My mother stopped caring about me the day I turned 10 and wasn't pretty enough to marry off." Margaret's expression hardened. "You're coming home." "No." "Lillian, I said no." Lillian's voice was firm, steady. "I'm not going back. Not now, not ever." "You're throwing your life away." "No, I'm finally living it." Margaret stared at her, and for a moment something like uncertainty flickered in her eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by cold resolve. "Your father will disown you." "I don't care." "You'll have nothing." "I already have everything I need." Margaret's gaze shifted to Ethan again, lingering. "Him?" Lillian hesitated, and Ethan's heart pounded. Then she straightened, met her aunt's eyes, and said, "Him, this place, this life. It's mine, and I'm keeping it." Margaret was silent for a long moment. Then she turned and walked to her horse. "You're making a mistake," she said as she mounted. "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." Margaret rode off without another word, and Lillian stood there, watching her go, her hands trembling. Ethan came to stand beside her. "You okay?" "I don't know." "You meant what you said about not going back?" "Yeah, I did." "Even if it means losing your family?" Lillian looked at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "They were never really my family, not the way that matters." Ethan's chest ached. "Then what is?" Lillian's mouth curved, sad but genuine. "This, you, us." And there it was. The truth, spoken out loud, hanging in the air between them. Ethan reached for her hand and she took it, her fingers curling around his. "Us," he repeated quietly. "Yeah, us." They stood there holding hands, and Ethan realized that this imperfect, hard-won, complicated thing they'd built was worth more than anything he'd lost. Bus. That night, they sat by the fire, and Ethan finally said the words he'd been holding back for months. "I love you." Lillian looked up, her eyes wide. "What?" "I love you. I don't know when it happened or how, but it did. And I needed you to know." Lillian's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she didn't speak. Then she crossed the room, sat beside him, and took his face in her hands. "I love you too," she whispered, and then she kissed him. It wasn't perfect. Their noses bumped, and Ethan's ribs twinged, and Lillian laughed against his mouth. But it was real, and it was theirs, and that was all that mattered. When they finally pulled apart, Lillian rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed. "I never thought I'd have this," she said softly. "Me neither. What do we do now?" Ethan smiled. "We keep going, together." "Together," Lillian echoed, and they did. Indecision. The months that followed were the best of Ethan's life. He and Lillian worked side by side, running the trading post, tending the garden, building a life that was messy and imperfect and entirely their own. They argued sometimes, about money, about priorities, about whose turn it was to chop wood, but they always made up. In the fall, they expanded the cabin, adding a second room and a larger porch. In the winter, they huddled by the fire, planning for the spring. And when spring came again, they planted the garden together, their hands dirty, their laughter echoing across the valley. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lillian spoke. "Do you ever miss it, the way things were before?" Ethan thought about it, about Sarah, about the grief, about the years he'd spent alone, convinced he didn't need anyone. "No," he said, "I don't. Not even a little? Not even a little." Lillian smiled, and Ethan realized something. Loving someone didn't mean forgetting the person you'd loved before. It didn't mean betraying their memory or diminishing what you'd shared. It just meant you were strong enough to keep living, to open your heart again, even when it had been broken. Sarah would have wanted that for him. He knew she would. "What are you thinking about?" Lillian asked. "The future." "Yeah? What does it look like?" Ethan looked at her, at the woman who'd walked into his life uninvited and refused to leave, who'd fought beside him and saved him and loved him despite all his flaws. "It looks like this," he said. "You and me. This place. Building something that lasts." Lillian's eyes softened. "That sounds pretty good." "Yeah, it does." They sat in silence, watching the light fade, and Ethan felt a peace he hadn't known was possible. Books. 2 years later, the trading post was thriving. They'd added a second building for storage, expanded the garden to include a small orchard, and even hired a young man named Ben to help with the heavy work. The valley was still remote, still harsh, but it was home. One morning, Lillian came to Ethan with news. "I'm pregnant." Ethan froze, a piece of wood slipping from his hands. "What?" "I'm pregnant, about 3 months along." Ethan stared at her, his mind struggling to catch up. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." 1,000 emotions hit him at once. Joy, fear, hope, terror. He didn't know which one to grab onto. "Are you okay?" he asked. Lillian laughed, a sound bright with happiness and nerves. "I'm terrified." "Me too. But also happy." "Yeah, me too." He crossed to her, pulled her into his arms, and held her tight. "We're going to be parents," he said, the words still not quite real. "We are. I don't know how to do this." "Neither do I, but we'll figure it out, together." Together. The word that had become their anchor, their promise, their truth. Ethan pulled back, looked at Lillian, and smiled. "Yeah, together." The baby came in late winter, a boy with dark hair and Lillian's sharp eyes. They named him Thomas, after Ethan's grandfather, and he was loud and demanding and perfect. Ethan held him for the first time, this tiny, fragile thing, and felt a terror so profound it almost knocked him over. But Lillian was there, watching him with tired, happy eyes, and he knew they'd be okay. They always figured it out. Thomas grew quickly, a bright, curious child who loved the outdoors and had no fear of anything. By the time he was 2, he was following Ethan around the property, asking 1,000 questions, getting into everything. "He's just like you," Lillian said one evening, watching Thomas try to climb a stack of firewood. "No, he's like you, stubborn." "I'm not stubborn." "You rode into a blizzard to get here. You're the definition of stubborn." Lillian laughed, and the sound filled the cabin, warm and alive. Ethan looked at her, at their son, at the life they'd built, and realized something. He'd spent 3 years after Sarah's death convinced that love was a liability, that caring meant losing, that the only way to survive was to shut everyone out. But he'd been wrong. Love wasn't weakness. It was strength. It was the thing that pulled you out of the snow when you were dying, the thing that made you fight when you wanted to give up, the thing that turned a barren, lonely existence into a life worth living. And it was the thing that kept you going, even when the world tried to break you. Ciao. Years passed. Thomas grew into a tall, strong boy who worked alongside his parents, learning the land, the trade, the rhythms of life in the high country. Lillian's hair started to gray at the temples, and Ethan's ribs stopped aching as much, though they never quite healed all the way. The trading post became a fixture in the territory, a place where people knew they could get fair deals and honest advice. Ethan and Lillian became fixtures too, the couple who'd stood their ground against Grayson, who'd built something out of nothing. They never got rich. The winters were still hard, the work still brutal, and there were days when Ethan wondered if they'd made the right choice. But then he'd look at Lillian, at Thomas, at the life they'd carved out of the wilderness, and he'd know. They had. One evening, when Thomas was 10 and playing by the creek, Ethan and Lillian sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the valley. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked. Lillian looked at him. "Regret what?" "Staying. Giving up your old life for this." Lillian was quiet for a moment, her eyes on the horizon. Then she smiled. "Not once." "Not even when things were hard?" "Especially then, because that's when I knew it mattered." Ethan nodded, and they sat in silence, holding hands the way they had that first night after Lillian had told off her aunt. "You know what I think?" Lillian said after a while. "What?" "I think people spend too much time looking for perfect. The perfect place, the perfect life, the perfect person. But perfect doesn't exist. What exists is real. Messy, imperfect, hard-won real. And that's better." Ethan looked at her, this woman who'd walked into his life when he'd needed her most, who'd stayed when he'd tried to push her away, who'd loved him despite all his broken edges. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It is." They sat there as the light faded, watching their son play, watching the valley settle into dusk, and Ethan felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was it. This was the life he'd fought for, bled for, nearly died for. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. There's something people don't tell you about survival. They focus on the dramatic moments, the fights, the storms, the near-death experiences. But survival isn't just about those moments. It's about what comes after. It's about waking up every morning and choosing to keep going, even when it's hard. It's about building something with your hands and watching it grow, imperfect and stubborn and real. It's about letting people in, even when you've been hurt, even when it's terrifying. It's about learning that strength isn't the same as being alone. Ethan had spent 3 years thinking he was strong because he didn't need anyone. But he'd been wrong. Real strength was admitting you couldn't do it alone. Real strength was accepting help, offering it in return, building something together that neither of you could have built on your own. Lillian had taught him that, not through words, but through actions. Through staying when he'd tried to push her away. Through fighting beside him when she could have run. Through loving him when he'd convinced himself he wasn't worth loving. And in return, he'd given her something she'd never had before. A place where she mattered, where her voice was heard, where she wasn't invisible. They'd saved each other in the ways that counted, not through grand gestures or perfect moments, but through the small daily acts of showing up, of doing the work, of choosing each other, again and again, even when it was hard. That's what love was, Ethan realized. Not a feeling, though the feeling was there, but a choice, a commitment, a promise to keep building, keep fighting, keep showing up, no matter what. And that was a promise he intended to keep. But on a warm afternoon in late spring, when Thomas was 12, a rider came to the trading post. Ethan recognized him immediately. It was Carver, older now, his beard fully gray, his movements slower. "Carver," Ethan said, coming out to meet him. "Been a while." "Too long." Carver dismounted, wincing. "Getting too old for this." "Aren't we all?" They clasped hands, and Carver looked around, his eyes taking in the expanded trading post, the orchard, the well-maintained cabin. "You've done well for yourself, Ethan." "We've done well. Couldn't have done it alone." Carver's eyes flicked to Lillian, who was helping a customer inside. "That woman of yours, she's something special." "Yeah, she is." "You marry her yet?" Ethan hesitated. "No." "Why the hell not?" "Never seemed necessary." Carver snorted. "You're a fool. Woman like that, you make it official. You hear me?" Ethan smiled. "Yeah, I hear you." After Carver left, Ethan stood on the porch, thinking. He and Lillian had built a life together, raised a son, run a business. They were partners in every way that mattered, but Carver was right. It was time to make it official. That evening, after Thomas had gone to bed, Ethan found Lillian in the garden, checking the tomato plants. Lillian. She looked up. Yeah? Will you marry me? Lillian blinked, her hands going still. What? I know we've been together for years. I know we have Thomas. I know we've built this life. But I want to make it official. I want to stand up in front of whoever's around and say that you're mine and I'm yours. Forever. Lillian's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. You're terrible at proposals. I know. You didn't even bring a ring. I'll make you one, or buy you one, whatever you want. Lillian laughed, wiping her eyes. You really mean it? Yeah, I do. She crossed to him, took his face in her hands, and kissed him. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. Ethan pulled her close, and they stood there in the garden, holding each other as the sun set and the world turned gold. Nkut. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony on the porch of the cabin. Thomas stood beside them, grinning, and a handful of neighbors and regular customers attended. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. Carver officiated, his voice gruff but sincere. Do you, Ethan Vale, take this woman to be your wife? I do. And do you, Lillian Cross, take this man to be your husband? I do. Then by the power vested in me by absolutely nobody, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. Ethan did, and their small audience cheered. That night, as they sat by the fire, Lillian leaned against Ethan's shoulder. We did it, she said softly. Yeah, we did. All of it, the land, the trading post, Thomas, us. Yeah. Lillian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Do you think Sarah would have approved? Ethan's throat tightened, but it didn't hurt the way it used to. Yeah, I think she would have. Really. She wanted me to be happy, and I am. So yeah, she would have approved. Lillian nodded, and they sat in comfortable silence. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees and the stars blazed overhead, indifferent and eternal. But inside the cabin, there was warmth and light and love, and that was enough. The years continued to pass, steady and sure. Thomas grew into a man, strong and capable, with Ethan's quiet determination and Lillian's sharp mind. He took over more of the work, eventually running the trading post himself when Ethan and Lillian were too old to manage it. Ethan's hair turned white, his hands gnarled with arthritis. Lillian's back bent, her steps slower. But they were still together, still working side by side, still choosing each other every single day. One evening, when they were both in their 60s, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. You ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't stopped here? Lillian asked. Ethan thought about it. Yeah, sometimes. What do you think? I think I would have died, either from the cold or the grief or just giving up. Lillian reached for his hand and he took it, their fingers intertwining the way they had 1,000 times before. And what do you think would have happened to me? She asked. I think you would have kept writing, found another place, built another life. Maybe, but it wouldn't have been this one. No, it wouldn't have. They sat in silence, watching the light fade. I'm glad I stopped, Lillian said finally. Me too. And that was the truth. The simple, uncomplicated truth. Life wasn't perfect. It never had been. There were hard winters and failed crops and arguments and injuries and all the 1,000 small struggles that came with living. But there was also love and laughter and the quiet satisfaction of building something that lasted. That was the lesson, Ethan realized. Not that love made everything easy, but that it made everything worth it. Because in the end, what mattered wasn't the struggles or the victories or even the land itself. What mattered was the people you shared it with, the people who stood beside you in the snow, who fought beside you when the odds were impossible, who chose to stay even when leaving would have been easier. Those were the people who made life worth living. And Ethan had found his person. Against all odds, in the most unlikely of places, at the most desperate of times, he'd found her, and she'd found him. And together they'd built something that neither of them could have built alone. A home, a family, a life. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect enough.